Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Dustin Byrd, professor of philosophy and religion at the University of Olivet, the founder and co-director of the Institute for Critical Social Theory, as well as the founder and editor-in-chief of Ekpyrosis Press. And today I have with me Dr. Rudolf Siebert, who is professor emeritus at Western Michigan University in the Department of Comparative Religion. He taught at Western for over 50 years. He's the founder and director of 2 international courses in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and in Yalta, Ukraine, and the Crimea. He has written over 30 books and hundreds of articles on a variety of topics, including the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, Hegel, political theology, philosophy of religion, psychology of religion, and of course, the critical theory of religion. He has recently published the book Hegel and Critical Theory of Religion with Ekpyrosis Press and is working on a new book as well. He's a member of the Institute of Critical Social Theory, which was founded in 2021. So welcome, Dr. Siebert.
Thank you.
Today, we're going to talk about the Christian responses to fascism. And this is a follow-up to the last 2 discourses that we had about the fascist temptation and then the democratic response to fascism. Today, we're going to talk about Christian responses to fascism. So the early 20th century has been well studied, especially the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. We know what fascism is. We know what the goals of fascism were and still are. And we know who the fascists targeted, and we know the ultimate historical catastrophe that fascism brought as it relates to World War II. What's more, we know that while the Nazis and other fascists were defeated on the battlefield, fascism as an ideology continues to this day within a variety of contexts. Given all that we know, one of the topics less studied regarding fascism are those who resisted historically as well as in the present moment from the Christian perspective. Among those who refused to succumb to the fascist temptation were these Christians, not all Christians, obviously, as more fascists were also baptized Catholics and Protestants, but many, born from their faith positions, refused to join in the collective psychosis that was fascist ideology, which with its pathological anti-Semitism, xenophobia, reactionary modernism, authoritarian deification of the leader and of the state, and racial nationalism, exclusionary identity politics, and territorial expansionism. Dr. Siebert has long studied both fascism and Christian resistance to fascism, which he experienced firsthand within the Third Reich in his own parish in Frankfurt, Germany. Dr. Siebert witnessed both Christian exuberance for fascism and the promise it made to destroy godless communism and end the chaos of democracy, as well as Christian resistance to fascism born from the deep-seated sense of agape, Christian social teachings, and the gospel command to love thy neighbor, especially when the neighbor is the hated other. So, Dr. Siebert, in light of all this, what was your earliest memories regarding the way in which Christians responded to fascism that you experienced as a youngster?
Okay, let me just say something about fascism as an ideology. We have an American name, ideology, and that means a combination of values and ideas. But there is a critical name as far as this is concerned. And the critical thing would be that we consider it as false consciousness or hiding of economic motivations or simply the untruth. So we probably should not start with fascism and simply say it's the untruth, but maybe call it, first of all, a philosophy. It is a philosophy of life, among other philosophies of life. And it was far beyond the fascist thing. This philosophy was around at this time. So that we should maybe start out and talk about fascism as a philosophy. And it is not easy to comprehend. It has many forms in many countries and so on. So it's not easy to know what it really is. So my first experience was I was 6 years old when Hitler came into power. And before that, in Frankfurt, on the east side of Frankfurt, the working class Frankfurt, There I saw Nazis and communists fighting each other right in front of my window there. That was my first contact with the political scene. And of course, when Hitler came into power, then the whole disorder disappeared. He was a law and order man. So at that time, before my 6th year, we went to a church in Frankfurt, the Women's Peace Church. All the women of Germany who had lost husbands and sons and so on, they built that church. They put together a little money they got from somewhere and built this wonderful church, which had a huge Madonna right in front of it. And inside there were pillars where all the fallen men, where their names were in those pillars. So that was my first experience. My parents took me there every Sunday. And at that time, of course, before Hitler came into power, there was no Kulturkampf, there was no cultural fight, there was peace between the state and religion. The Kulturkampf had been under Bismarck's Second Empire. There, church and state struggled with each other, but not in the Weimar Republic. There was peace between the state and the church. And that is true also for the beginning of Hitler's regime, because Hitler, in the first years of his government, he concluded the Reichskonkordat, the empire concorded, or a treaty between Hitler and the Vatican. And that was preceded by the Lateran Treaty, which Mussolini had made with the papacy. So there was a time where the church gave the first recognition to the fascist states and told the world that it was really acceptable. So that is where we could say the church fell into the fascist temptation. And the reason why it did that was the threat of communism. So communism had won the revolution in Russia, and they were afraid it would come all over Europe, and that was the arch enemy. So when I then went from this Women's Peace Church over to another place outside of Frankfurt, the Family Church, Holy Family Church, there also in the beginning, there was peace between the church and the state because of the Concordat. And the priests could go to the state schools and could teach religion there. And that explains why the churches, like for instance, my church with the Pastor Rudolfi, had the Nazi flag besides the church flag in honor of the new regime coming in. So they trusted in the first years that the fascist government would keep the treaty and that the peace between church and state would go on. But then this Concordat, this treaty was betrayed from the fascist side. So I felt that in the Catholic youth movement. So in the first years, there were maybe 1-2 years, we could move around in the Catholic youth movement, like the Hitler youth movement. And but then suddenly the persecution started. So my leaders were beaten up, some of them were killed, some were so tortured before their death that we could not even open up the coffins and see them in the cathedral down in Frankfurt. So that is when the hostilities started. So I wrote a book about my pastor Rudolfi, and a friend of mine wrote a book too. He portrayed Rudolfi as a fascist. I portrayed him as a resistance fighter against fascism. So he thought that because he put up that flag, he was a Nazi himself. But he never put the flag up again, and then had the Gestapo in his church all the time, and they watched their sermons, his sermons. And many of these Gestapo people were ex-priests, so they knew exactly what he was talking about. So these were the experiences then, and I experienced Rudolfi as one of those people who resisted, particularly in his sermons. And we were really tense when these sermons were made, because we knew how dangerous it was whenever he would say something about Judaism or about the prophet Isaiah or Jeremiah or so. That was dangerous territory because it was Jewish. So these were my first impressions of the whole relationship between fascism and the church.
What motivated people like Rudolphi and the Confessing Church and Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer to resist fascism?
I think they slowly they discovered what it really was. So I said before that it's not so easy to recognize it. We have it even today where fascists here in this country call other people fascists. So that is really confusing. So, but slowly they discovered that what was written in the Hebrew Bible and what was written in the New Testament was not in accordance with that, or the other way around, that fascism was not in accordance with the revelation, the Jewish revelation or the Christian revelation. That means that it was pagan, that its whole ethics, the idea of the aristocratic principle of nature, that this ethics with the alpha guy, the leader, the top man, the authority, and so on, that all that was not in conformity with the spirit of Jesus.
Yeah, and yet so much of the Christian community and the churches went along with fascism or devoutly followed Hitler into fascism. Uh, so was it really the anti-communism thing, the Palin project, rebirth of Germany? I mean, what was
Yeah,
it that caused so many of these Christians to follow him?
all of that, but also the whole issue of the Constantinian Christianity. That means from the time on when Constantine made peace between the state and the church, and the church had to pay a price for this. So, for instance, no soldiers could be in the church before Constantine or before Diocletian. And suddenly there was a just war theory where the church, which always said no war, no war, suddenly said there could be some wars which would be just in order to defend the virgins in Rome against the Germanic tribesmen. So there could be good reasons. And St. Augustine then developed the just war theory. And from then on, there were army chaplains up to Hitler had hundreds of army chaplains in his 4 million man army, which marched into Russia. So the Russian army did not have any army chaplains anymore, but the fascist armies did, not because they believed in it, but they thought there were some people who could not die without some help, without some priest, without some God, and so on. And they made a concession to that. So if they cannot die without God, let them die with God. And so they had army chaplains. And the army chaplains went along and they had mass confessions. So before they killed the 26 million Russians, they always asked for forgiveness of this great sin, which they were in process of committing. So that was some kind, it was not real faith which they had on the Nazi side, but they used it as a means of social control and in order to make some people happy who were too weak to die in the battlefield without religion.
So were those Christians who opposed Hitler and opposed Nazism, fascism in general, were they persecuted for their positions?
We had, I mean, there were Christians who then did not go along with this Constantinian Christianity and, for instance, opposed to go into the army. There were two farmers who were in southern Germany who resisted. And when they were drafted, they did not go. They resisted it, and they were both sentenced to death. And the priest who went with them for the execution told them that the state was right and not they. So there was no conscientious objector status in the Roman Catholic Church. That came only after the Second Vatican Council. So they could not base their resistance on church orders or church laws, and were all alone in a certain sense, left alone even to the moment of their death, where the priest told them that this was not right what they did, and that they somehow died rightly and justly. So it is the whole project of the Constantinian Church. Constantine was baptized by an Arian bishop. He had postponed his baptism because there was no sacrament of confession yet. So in baptism, you were forgiven all your sins. But so when you plan to do some sins, then it was better to postpone your baptism up to the hour of death. And he killed his son and his wife because he thought they had some relationship to each other, a strange one. And so many other deeds he did. So it was very good for him to postpone. But that means he was baptized by an Arian, which was heresy, really, namely that Jesus was not God, but Jesus was only the first creation of God. He had a particular status, but not the status of divinity, which then later on the church decided on. So they're very problematic in many ways from the very start. And after the Vatican Council, people thought they could get rid of this Constantinian Christianity. And some of the resistors of fascism had fought for that, but it hasn't happened yet.
It's so interesting to me at this time period to see so many of the churches reconcile themselves to the state, in this case, the fascist state, and to Hitler himself, despite the fact that Hitler had a rather dim view of Christianity. What was Hitler's views about Christianity?
Well, I mean, Hitler's religion, books have written about that, but it is still not very clear. It seems that he did not want to have any contact between his party and the church. People say he never went to church, but there are pictures where he comes out of a church. So obviously he did go to church. And he says they thought he was anti-clerical or whatever. But he had a lot of priest friends already when he was in Vienna. And the paintings, he gave the paintings to priests and they sold it for him. And he made a living out of this. So, but there was Father Leo who visited him continually. He had left an order, but he was still a secular priest. And they had many, many discourses with each other in Hitler's apartment in Munich. And then happened the night of what was it called? When the SS tried to annihilate the leadership of the SA.
Oh, the night of the long knives, right?
Of the long knives, exactly. And they accidentally, Father Leo got into that slaughter. They killed over 100 SA leaders who had a convention down in Munich, and some of them were homosexuals. And so they pulled them out of their beds in the villages around Munich and killed them all. And Father Leo was somewhat caught up into that, and so they killed him too. And Hitler was running around in his apartment in Munich for months and shouted, "They killed my dear Father Leo, they killed my dear Father Leo, the bastards," and so on. And cursed his own SS for killing his Father Leo. So it was very ambiguous in a certain sense. Certainly, Hitler had a Catholic education in the high school and the elementary schools. He was educated by priests and nuns. And also his wife, Eva Braun, was also in a monastery school and was educated by nuns as well. So I think it is still somewhat a riddle what became of their Catholicism. They certainly were alienated from it. And in the end, the day before his death, he still called in the justice of the peace to get married with Eva Braun. He did not call a priest or whatever. So he died without any assistance. He was strong enough to die without church or God or whatever. So it is not, he talked a lot about providence, that providence had led him and the nation the way they went now. He spoke about the Almighty very often and so on. So, as army chaplains had done in the First World War, and as our army chaplains had done during the Civil War, where the more of the enemies you killed, the closer you were to heaven and so on. So, a horrible, horrible distortion of the whole Christian message. So it has become doubtful in a certain way if the whole missionary activities of the Germanic tribesmen did really go well, or if it was more a superficial thing, like Charlemagne, for instance, killed thousands of leaders, Saxons who refused to get baptized, and he killed them. And so a lot of this conversion happened because of political power or military power, and did not really transform the heart in terms of metanoia, of being changed around inside. And this is even true then for the murderous things which happened in the 20th century, where the Germans paid a lot to the state of Israel. But I wonder if it was a real conversion in which they really believed that something horrible had happened. Certainly, all the leaders who were responsible for it never repented. They thought they had not killed enough Jews, not that they had killed so many. So the whole Christianization of Europe is a problematic thing. There were certainly great saintly persons there, but as far as the masses of the people is concerned, the conversion seems to have been very superficial.
In Hitler's Table Talk, it's a nice volume that came out, I think, in the year 2000, edited by Hugh Trevor Roper. Hitler constantly refers to Christianity as the Bolshevism of the Roman Empire, that somehow it was responsible for the ending or the downfall of the Roman Empire. What does he mean by that? By Christianity is the Bolshevism, the communism of the Roman Empire?
Well, the question about Christianity and slavery, there was 100 years before Jesus, there was Spartacus, of course, and that was a real rebellion of the slaves against the Roman Empire, led by gladiators and so on. But Spartacus was betrayed by the Navy people, by ships who were supposed to transport him from northern Italy to southern Italy. They did not come, and so he was faced with a battle with the Roman army and lost the battle. And 10,000 slaves were then crucified on the Via Appia. And the question is if Spartacus was crucified as well, or if he fell in battle. And Christian writers were very much inclined to say that he fell in battle and was not crucified, because otherwise he would have brought him too close to Jesus and Jesus' crucifixion and so on. So nevertheless, the Christian method of dealing with the class system, and that is what the Roman Empire was based on. And if one would destroy that basis, then one would destroy the empire. So Paul sent a slave back to his master and said, you know, I pay you whatever losses you had. And but remember, no, he is now your brother. He's a Christian like you. And so it was by changing people in terms of the slaves as well as of the masters, which then could be interpreted as undermining the class structure on which the Roman Empire rested. And then one could say that the Christianity was the cause for the collapse of the Roman Empire. But I think there were certainly other causes as well. But if one looks at the Christian attitude towards slavery, then one can say that Christianity had something to do with the fall of Rome. Also later on, up in the 15th century, the papacy argued against slavery, but nobody listened to them. So Georgetown University was built by slaves here in this country. So people did not simply not obey what the papacy had to do. The slavery developed against the teaching of the church. So nevertheless, this tradition to fight for equality and be opposed to class systems certainly had something to do with the demolishing of the empire. So Mussolini and Hitler thought very highly of the Roman Empire, of course. So the swastika, or rather the whole symbolism of Roman justice, which Mussolini had, that's where fascism comes from. Fas says the sticks with an axe in it, which was the symbol of the Roman justice. So when Hitler had diplomats coming from Rome, and they were addressed like a cardinal, and that was the dress of the Roman senator, he had high respect for them. So he respected very much the Roman element in the Roman Catholic Church to which he belonged. He just hated the Jewish element, that the people, the Jewish people, were the chosen people. He said there can only be one chosen people. He had some kind of a frantic outbreak once and said there can be only one chosen people, and that is the German people. So he was also willing to accept the Greek part of the Orthodox Church, but also of the Roman Catholic Church. So it was an ambiguous attitude which he had toward the church. He looked down on Protestant bishops so because they came in civilian uniform clothing, and in spite of that fact, he had a German church with the Bishop Müller. He tried that once to have an empire church. So we see that it's not so easy to understand fascism because there are so many contradictions and so many ambiguities involved in it from place to place.
Yeah, it seems like even though he had this rather, pessimistic, or not even pessimistic, really just negative attitude, negative understanding of Christianity, that it was in the echoing Nietzsche, it was slave morality that had somehow mastered the Greeks and conquered the Romans, and brought about this principle of equality as opposed to this natural hierarchy of those two civilizations. While at the same time he has this bad attitude, this bad evaluation of Christianity, he also demands Gleichschaltung, right? So cooperation from the German churches. So not their destruction, but cooperation, that they become an instrument of the state to, control the people, to make the people subservient, to bring the people into line, or to make them unified in many ways with the Fuhrer. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. So it's this weird, type of, this is an institution that destroyed the great Roman Empire and destroyed the Greeks, yet I need to bring it into the Reich. I need to Nazify it so it becomes a tool of the Third Reich, of fascism.
Now, yeah, we have to take into consideration, of course, that he was a Schopenhauerian. That is very often forgotten, that he had the volumes in his rucksack there during the First World War, and always between the battles, he would sit down and study Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is the father of Occidental pessimism. And so he shared this Schopenhauerianism with, first of all, with Goebbels, his propaganda minister. They talked about Schopenhauer even in the last days in Berlin, when they were under bombardment, and over the telephone, they talked with each other about Schopenhauer. And it would be interesting if they talked about 3 volumes about the will to power, or about the last volume, which is about redemption from the will to power. So he shared this Schopenhauer with Thomas Mann, for instance, a highly humanistic German poet, but also with Sigmund Freud, and also with the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer and Adorno. They were all Schopenhauerians. So he belongs to some kind of a community which we usually do not connect with fascism, but rather with the opposition to fascism. So maybe it has something to do with the fact that Hitler did not have a formal university education, and therefore that many things remained unclear. But the Schopenhauer brought Hitler into contact also with Nietzsche, and he brought him into contact also with the Wagner family. He was almost the son of the family. He was very close to one of the women who was a mother figure somehow for him. And of course, even when he was chancellor still, he would sneak anonymously into the opera house at night and listen to Wagner music. So that is it's strange for us that a politician should also be a philosopher or an artist or whatever. So in that sense, again, fascism poses somewhat a riddle in many ways, and it's so easy, so hard to comprehend as a philosophy, and then to prove that it is not a philosophy but an ideology, meaning the untruth.
Yeah, and to try to reconcile it with Christianity, at least, the social gospel. Blessed are the poor, and blessed are the meek, blessed are the those who've been left in the ditch of history, the victims of history, and somehow taking that type of social gospel, that type of ethical philosophy, and reconciling it with racism, and reconciling it with this idea of racial superiority, and the Aryan superiority, and the right of the predator to destroy the prey. It just seems like there's no way to reconcile it, and yet millions found a way of doing that. I mean, how can that be? How can that cognitive dissonance be overcome?
It can be because, in a certain sense, Christianity was Germanized for a long time. Hitler was not responsible for that. So he had a very powerful anti-Semitic mayor in Vienna, and the schools into which he went, they had long made peace between Christianity and the state and the Germanic heritage and so on. So that is not of his doing. So his race theory came originally from England and then from France. And only then it came to Germany, and there he pushed it to the extreme, which never anybody had done before. But it was something shared in all over Europe, and that explains it while all over Europe was fascist. So Hungary was fascist. I fought together with Hungarian officers who were all fascists, but it was Italy, it was Croatia, it was Spain, it was Portugal, and particularly Catholic countries, first of all, because of the authoritarian side. So the Roman Catholic was an authoritarian church, and that was what impressed itself on Hitler. See, somehow the Catholic Church delivered to Nazism the authoritarian personality already formed and shaped. And then, of course, it was easy to make out of these Catholic authoritarians the fascist Germanic authoritarians, Aryan authoritarians, and so on. So, I mean, fascism also then appeared, of course, in Northern Europe, not only in Bavaria, but also in Prussia. But it had its main roots in Roman Catholic territories. That means what the Jesuits during the Reformation were able to rescue the southern part of Europe, which then also shaped the religion of Latin America, and the northern nations, which shaped the Protestant faith of North America. But it did not originate in Protestant countries. Protestantism was democratic, but rather in Roman Catholic nations.
Yeah, and it seemed like that instead of just rejecting Jesus of Nazareth outright, that somehow they had to transform him into something. And of course, that something that they transformed him into is no longer Jewish, but he's Aryan. He's the son of Pantera, right? This Roman Aryan. And so even Jesus had to be transformed, not only the religion about him, but he himself had to be transformed in order to be reconciled with the fascist philosophy.
I mean, for Hitler, Jesus was a great man of history. He was a great theoretician. So, and as such, he respected him very highly. And he rather saw him as anti-Semitic, as somebody who was in opposition to this Jewish state, and therefore was also crucified by the Jewish state. So he made him into a friend of the Germanic tribesmen in a certain sense. So, and there was, of course, also the issue, the virgin birth, that Mary rather was married with one of the legionnaires who were stationed in Palestine. And so that came from Gallia, and so they were Germanic tribesmen, and so Jesus had somehow an Aryan birth. He came from an Aryan parent. So all these were constructs in order to assimilate the core of the Christian message and bring it on the side of fascism, including the idea that there can only be one chosen people, and this is the chosen German people.
Yes, well, I want to turn to the Catholic Church and the hierarchy. Pope Pius XI issued the encyclical letter Mit brennender Sorge, with deep anxiety, in 1937, which denounced numerous aspects of Nazi ideology. Mentioned within the encyclical letters that the pantheistic confusion it has, that neo-paganism of Nazism, the myth of race and blood, the idealization of the state. Now, when he released this in 1937, I mean, that's Hitler had only been in power, came to power in 33, so that's 4 years into it, but the war hadn't begun yet in 39. Did this encyclical letter coming from Pope Pius XI had any effect whatsoever on Nazi-supporting German Catholics?
No, no effect whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it was preceded by the Lateran Treaty and by the Reichskonkordat. So the church had done its job. It had made Hitler acceptable diplomatically. It was the first treaty which Hitler made was with the Vatican. And after that was done, they were not further interested. They were angry about that encyclical letter in the Nazis. And somehow, at one point, Hitler wanted to capture the Pope and take him out of Rome, but the diplomats thought that wasn't a good idea. But the encyclical made him very angry. But I think that was the only effect it really had. It just came too late.
So it came too late and had very little influence. I mean, that's almost like the state of the church in the modern period. Things just come too late and they have no influence whatsoever, even right on up to today, unfortunately. And there's also been a lot of discussion for years now about Pope Pius XII, or Eugenio Pacelli, who was the foreign minister of the Vatican who signed the Reichskonkordat. But when he became Pope, his actions in regard to Jewish suffering and anti-Semitism of the Nazis has been discussed a lot. In fact, all these books from right here to here are basically on Eugenio Pacelli and Pope Pius XII and his actions during World War II. Some point to his public quietism as proof of his tacit support for the destruction of European Jewry, while others show that he worked behind the scenes to not only oppose Hitler and Mussolini, but also to save the lives of as many Jews as he possibly could. There's not only books, but there's even movies about this. Some people call him Hitler's Pope, and other people would say, no, Hitler's Cardinal, because when he became Pope, he changed his mind on a lot of this. Where does this stand right now in the scholarship, or maybe within the Catholic community? What's the legacy of Pope Pius XII in regards to anti-Semitism and fascism?
Well, when I grew up in Nazi Germany in the parish in Frankfurt, we were always told by the pastor and the chaplain and so on that Pope Pius the 12th loved the Germans, so that he had been in Germany as a nuntius, that he spoke German well, that he was sitting all night long in his office in the Vatican and worked hard for the Germans and so on and so on. So that is how he was portrayed. I think he did have some sympathy for Germany, but I think that he was not. He should have said something when this catastrophe, the Holocaust, started to be developed. He had news of it. He was well informed about it. There was an officer, a German officer, who came back from the Eastern Front, and on the way, he suddenly, in the middle of the forest, he discovered a concentration camp, and he found out that people were gassed there. And he went to Berlin, and he went to the nuntius and told him about that story, but the nuntius did not send it to Rome because he thought it was a Nazi trick. They wanted to catch him. And so that is where he did not hear anything, but he had other sources. So he was well informed what was going on. I think he did not want to make the situation of the Catholics in Germany and Italy and so on more precarious than it was already. So that is what he was careful. He was under no way with them in this. He was not for what they did, but I think he could not go further as far as his protests were concerned, because he would endanger all the Catholics who were under fascist control all over Europe. So it is true that monasteries took up Jewish people and rescued them, that individual priests did this. But it's also true that there were bishops in the Vatican, but all over Europe, who joined the fascist party, had joined the fascist party. So it was he had to do some kind of a balancing act. But they tried to canonize him, and the canonization was stopped because of these considerations, because he was quiet and he had the authority. He should have had the courage, and well, he should maybe have endangered all these Catholics in order to stand up for the truth and so on, and call it a weakness or whatever, or prudence or whatever it was. So it's still very questionable if one should canonize him. I think the work is going on. There are people who still want to have him somehow canonized. But at the moment, I think it has come to a standstill.
Yeah, and he is buried in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
Mhm.
You know, it's a checkered record, it's a mixed record, but you know, there's a record that he helped shelter Jews in the Fate Bene Fratelli hospital and the Tiber Island in Rome. And next to that place right now is a chapel or a little small church for modern day martyrs that I visited not too long ago. And but yeah, I mean, the main criticism I've always heard is that it wasn't public, and that if he would have been more public about his opposition to the destruction of European Jewry, that Christians, including Germans, would have been more forceful in their resistance to fascism. But I just don't see it. I don't see how, you know, even if he was public, how they would have turned on the Nazis, especially in, you know, in the late 30s, early 40s, when things were actually going well in the war efforts and things like that. Maybe at the very end, it's possible, but I don't think the church, even among Catholics in Germany at that time, had that kind of strong kind of influence on them, as we were just talking about with the encyclical letter for Pope Pius XI.
Yeah. And I mean, Stauffenberg was a Catholic, and these Stauffenberg Catholics who, you know, who finally rebelled were with Hitler when he was winning. And then they left him and wanted to assassinate him when he was losing. It all came somewhat late, the whole thing. But there was Father Delp, for instance, who went through a college where I taught in Germany. And Father Delp was a member of the Kreisau-Kreis, three people who came together and just committed the crime to discuss what would happen when Hitler would leave office and so on. But that was already a mortal issue, and the death penalty for it. And so he was finally executed in Berlin, Plötzensee, toward the end of the war. And he was a Jesuit who thought that the whole diplomacy game of the Pope, that means that he wanted to be diplomatic and wanted to be prudent and so on. He thought that all these nuncii, they should all be canceled, and the Pope should simply follow the Sermon on the Mount and should follow the teaching of Jesus, and that's it. That this diplomacy was just another temptation, and that it did not come to any positive results anyway. So there is an opposition, but not even his order was really with him. They washed his clothing, but otherwise they did not support him. And he was a very courageous man. When he came in Berlin to the curtain behind which the hanging took place, and the hanging was a strangulation, not breaking the neck, which was short, would be short type of a death, but a long type of torturous death. And they were a Protestant minister on one side, a Catholic priest on the other side, and whoever went behind that curtain could still talk with them. And he talked with a Catholic priest standing there and said, in a few minutes, I will be with your boss, and I will know more than you do. So like Thomas More, he kept his humor to the end of his life. So very courageous martyr of Christianity. But these people would not have been on the side of what the Pope did with all his diplomacy and prudence, because that's what it was. I think the Pope wanted to be diplomatic, and he wanted to be prudent, and he wanted to protect all the Catholics and so on. And thereby he became guilty, I think. And so therefore I'm questioning if they will ever come to the point where they will canonize him.
Many today believe that Christianity can and should, both Protestant and Catholic, be indicted historically for its part in World War II and fascism and in the Holocaust. That somehow all of this grew out of Christianity in and of itself. It was a Christian, not a Christian project in many ways. Do you agree with that position, or can we not hold Christianity responsible for the crimes of its adherents?
Yeah, maybe not Christianity, but certain groups of Christians who represented Christianity. There was centuries of Catholic anti-Semitism. Every Good Friday, people went into the Jewish ghettos and raped and murdered and burned down the synagogues for centuries and centuries in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Spain, everywhere. And then there was also Protestant anti-Semitism. Luther had a book against the Jews, which is horrible. So this Hitler anti-Semitism was not religious any longer, but it was certainly prepared by the religious anti-Semitism. So therefore, one must say that there is some culpability, that there is some guilt involved. We cannot do that centuries and then prepare this Nazi movement. And in spite of the fact that these Nazis did not do it in a religious way anymore, but had a scientific, so-called scientific basis in terms of Nazi anthropology. And but it was certainly in the masses of the people, it was prepared. So besides secular charges against Judaism, that they were cheating in business and were money people and were materialists and so on, there were also the charges that they were Christ killers and finally God killers, and that if they would not convert, the kingdom could not come. And therefore, the whole horror of the world as it is was blamed on the Jews then. So this whole horrible history of prejudice certainly has something to do with fascism, and the fascists are, I think the Christian Catholics and Protestants are somewhat co-responsible that it could come about and that they did not resist it adequately. And Franco somehow kept his Catholic faith as a fascist. And once he told Hitler, he said, that the Blessed Mother had helped him to win victory over the communists. And Hitler said, it was not the Blessed Mother, it was me. So he bombarded Guernica, and he bombarded Madrid at the same time. And he used and tried out his air force. That did it, not the Blessed Mother. So certainly there was some degree of Catholicism still left in Franco, which was not there any longer in Hitler.
Yeah, so we're at a point today where we're seeing once again the rise of alternative forms of fascism, as we talked about earlier, fascists who call anti-fascists fascists, and on and on and on. But we've got alternative forms of fascism, new forms of fascism that have somehow instantiated the cultures in which that they're growing. Why is it important for Christians today to resist the fascist temptation? Because that fascist temptation seems to be very strong, especially among conservatives. Sometimes they're not even religious. Like in Europe, for instance, Christianity is being recruited into this identitarian politics that's somehow standing against what they would call in Germany Völkerchaos, right? This chaos of people, or Unvölkung, the unculturing or deculturization of the Germans, turning them into a multicultural society. And that has led to a lot of people having a whole lot of sympathy for these new fascist, anti-immigrant organizations. But then also the backlash, as we saw these last week or two in Germany, where there's massive protests against the far right. So, but I wonder how much of it is Christian. How much involvement are how involved are the Christian churches on either side? And somehow it seems to me that oftentimes the churches will diagnose a society to having certain ills, that the fascists will also diagnose that society for having those same ills. Well, how you go about dealing with those ills seems to be the key question. Do the churches join the fascists to attack those ills in a certain way, or do they look for other ways and other means of dealing with these ills?
Well, you have, for instance, one side, Faithful America, which is a Christian movement, which is opposed to all fascist tendencies in our country. But then you have the Christian nationalists, who are much stronger and who represent those fascist elements. And of course, when somebody, wants to exclude people, immigrants or whatever, then a Christian will be motivated by the Good Samaritan example, the Good Samaritan who breaks through in-group, out-group, racial and religious in-groups and out-groups. And so the non-Jew, the Samaritan, takes care of the Jew who has fallen among the robbers and so on. So he is somebody who believes in the teaching of Jesus, the Good Samaritan, will of course have a certain attitude toward the so-called ills, what happens at the southern border and so on. So they will be more inclusive. And the others who are more of the fascist type, they are powerfully exclusive. And so the question is how Christian the Christians are. Do they really take Jesus' teaching seriously of the Good Samaritan? Or say, well, it's just a story, and follow more their own nationalistic feelings? which is really the case now with us. But behind that is, of course, a deep fear. I think already under the Hitler movement and Franco movement and so on, the fear of replacement, that people of another race, Arabs and so on, are coming and undermining one's culture and civilization, get intermarried. In my family, my grandchildren, one married a Jewish person, two married a Jewish person, one married an Arabic person from Egypt, and so on. For 500 years, that did not happen in my family. So they were proud of their family tree, and they proved to the Nazi people that they were pure, that they had no other race, and so on. And so, but I mean, the time probably has come, maybe, that the races separated by continents and so on are coming together in a reunion of the human species. But nevertheless, that is the old sentiment of keeping the family racially pure and so on. But that time is over, and new dimensions are opening up for people today. So therefore, we have that struggle of inclusive democratic characters and exclusive authoritarian characters who are struggling with each other. And we are not sure during this year what the election will bring. Daily one has the feeling that these authoritarian types are tremendously strong and powerful.
Yeah, and it seems to me that Christianity has been recruited into these movements because it has resources that can be utilized in a defensive way. It's almost like a reassertion that we are a Christian society, despite the fact that, I mean, the West by and large is not a Christian society. I mean, the majority religion is Christianity, but the societies aren't Christian by any means. But it's a way of saying we are this, and therefore you are not of us. You're not of our spirit. You're not of our history. Even though, if in many cases, for a lot of these far right groups, even if you are of a different race, but you live according to our culture and you assimilate to our culture, that's perfectly fine. But it's the problem of bringing another culture into us. And because the West, in many cases, the right wing in the West says that we left our Christianity behind, we left our traditional ideals behind, we left our particularity behind, we no longer have any resources to defend ourselves. And that's how we're going to be Islamized in the West, and therefore, or Arabicized and Africanized, and therefore we have to retreat back into Christianity, even if we don't believe anything of it in substantively. We have to maintain the identity of it, therefore, to push them out, to make them the permanent alien.
Yeah. And what they want to do today is, of course, simply that these people go home. They all should go home. They don't want to gas them, but they should go home. But that may just be a stage in a certain development. The Nazis did also not tell people from the beginning that they would gas people. They also thought if they would just go home. So, but then it developed stage after stage after stage until it came to this annihilation program. So, yeah, so the question is for Christian, how genuine they are, how seriously they take, also in political things, the Good Samaritan or other stories in which Jesus expressed his teaching, and in a rather simple way so that everybody can understand it. But somehow there is in the Sermon on the Mount, there's the golden rule. And for about 20 years, I am in discourse with Russian people, Russian scholars. And what I did all the time was this, emphasizing this golden rule. It is so simple. Don't do to other people what you don't want to have done to you, or whatever version of that. Most world religions have that. It seems to be so simple, but it seems to be so unbelievably hard to do it. And it's always a great riddle for me why it is so difficult to understand. So we have this situation with the Ukraine. We had the Cuba crisis. We did not like what they did to us when they went to Cuba, and we resisted it, even with the risk of the atomic war, and they went home. But that we are in their territory now, we don't understand. Somehow that is hidden from us. Or we are aware of the object, the enemy, but we are not aware of ourselves and what role we play in this whole issue. There is something maybe 60,000 years ago, we became self-conscious, and looks as if we were not aware of ourselves. If we think of Palestine, we were liberated by Washington from British colonialism. And Mahatma Gandhi did that for India, and a great man did it for South Africa. But when the Palestinians want to do the same thing and free themselves from colonialism, then we just don't understand it. We cannot make the connection. Who we are ourselves. We are aware what the objectives is like, what the others are like, but not who we are and what role we play and what we are responsible for. So that is what Christianity could still teach us, the plank in the eye of the other.
Right.
In my eye.
Self-reflexivity, you know, when
Right.
something happened to you in traditional Christianity, when something horrible happened to you, the first response was always to self-reflect, you know, what did I do? You know,
Right.
it's my sin to think about it. And that's something that in modernity, at least in the Western modernity, we immediately go, what did they do? And not what did we do?
Yeah, right. So that I mean, since 10 years or so, we made Putin into the enemy. Carl Schmitt, the fascist, teaches that he said politics, he defined politics as the art of identifying the enemy. And now everybody's doing this. We're identifying the enemy, and that seems to be the core of our politics. Okay, nevertheless, we can do whatever we want to with the object, with the enemy or whatever. But at the same time, why are we not aware of what happened to us, who we are? We are the people, we are the colony which was decolonized. We were the ones who were attacked in Cuba, and we reacted in a certain way. And why is there no equivalence that we can think that the others may be like us and wanted to have the same rights? So there's something fundamentally, psychologically going on, which is very dangerous. It is as if we were going back in time where we had no consciousness of ourselves yet.
With all of this in mind, with the history in mind, with the present understanding in mind, we have to do, as we always said, a future-oriented remembrance. So what does the future look like? What's the prognosis for Christianity? Will it continue to either go the way of the dodo bird and become extinct, or will it attach itself to the right wing as a way of surviving modernity? Or is there a possibility and a hope that a Christian left, a liberational, emancipatory form of Christianity can contribute to a more future-oriented, reconciled society?
Well, Christianity is a tough cookie. There is the promise that the doors of hell will not overwhelm the church, that the church will continue in spite of all the whole horror which happens outside of the church and also inside of the church. One can even say, you know, it's a miracle that this church continued when you see the unbelievable scandals through the centuries and so on. But of course, the Buddhists have lasted longer even. So it happens to other religions as well. But nevertheless, there is this hope that the kingdom of God is founded from the beginning and that the church will not be overwhelmed by other forces. And somehow there are always people like Bonhoeffer and like Rudolf J and like Delp and people who are grasped by this message and by this hope, and who are even willing to risk their life in the whole thing. So I think as far as the future is concerned, it's possible that a new authoritarian age is rising, and that we have to go through this. But I think that also one should not underestimate the power of the spiritual power of these great martyrs of the 20th century. Only who knows how powerful fascism can be and how much courage it needs for an individual or group to resist it. Before you experience that, you have no idea how powerful that is. When your neighbors become fascist, when they can denounce you to the party, when you cannot listen to the radio, otherwise your neighbor will get you to the execution. So it is when one makes Hitler into a little clown or whatever, therefore people think, it's maybe a funny thing or whatever, but it's not. It is something very powerful and very dangerous. But I think there will be people who will resist it. And they do still resisting it. Our courts are resisting it now. So there is the fascist temptation with us now, but there are still many democratic forces in our society which don't want that to happen. And we can only hope that they will make it.
So like democracy in our last discourse, Christianity and Christians have to resist this fascist temptation as much as they possibly can.
I mean, there are democratic elements in Christianity from the very beginning. Also in Judaism, there were Jewish tribes which were democratic. The church in the beginning was democratic and was communistic, and only slowly became monarchical and aristocratic. And only now the Sodanity movement brings in the democratic element again. So even in the authoritarian church, we have a moment now where democratic forces come into the foreground, but against the great resistance of the American Catholic Church.
Right. So we've got challenges ahead of us, and hopefully those who have, attached themselves to the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, like those who have attached themselves to the democratic way of being in the world, can find the wherewithal to resist this slide into fascism. So thank you, Dr. Siebert, for doing this discourse today. This was a wonderful discussion, and I hope everyone who's watching it learned something, enjoyed it, and hopefully will join us again in our next discourse. All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.